Hi, welcome to Chapter 16 of Guns for General Washington, The Ghosts of Bloody Pond. They'd been on the trail all day, but Henry, trying to make up lost time, decided to push on a while longer. At that point, the Becker's wagon was up in front, and J.P. was feeling pleased with himself. With only a little help from his pa, he'd managed the horses like an expert. The heavy vehicles creaked slowly along the narrow trail on the west bank of the Hudson. It was growing dark, and a white mist was creeping across the river. J.P.'s father dozed on the seat beside him. Over his shoulder, the boy could see the other sleds and cans following behind. The drivers and soldiers were surprisingly quiet. Even the animals seemed to doze in their traces as they trudged along. A pale half-moon rose, winking through the pines, while the mist crept in and out of the dark branches. Caw! 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 A flight of crows exploded from the trees, complaining loudly at the human intruders. Somewhere an owl hooted, getting ready to hunt for his supper. J.P. was feeling tired. He was also vaguely uneasy. Looking around, he noticed some landmarks and recognized where he was. 20 years ago, this part of the countryside had been a bloody battleground. It was during the French and Indian Wars, a time when French troops and their Indian allies fought the British for control of New England and Canada. The British had finally won, but only years after heavy fighting. On this very spot, there had been a fierce battle. J.P. had heard the whole story from the old-timers. The fight had raged all day long, seesawing back and forth, and there had been many killed on both sides. Some of the bodies had been flung into a nearby pond, and it was known ever since as Bloody Pond. And folks said the forest was haunted by the ghosts of those who wouldn't stay down in their watery grave. Inching along with the pines looming overhead, J.P. remembered the grisly tale. His eyes were heavy with sleep, and in the gloom, he thought he could almost see the flitting shades of Bloody Pond. He stifled a cry. Yes, there they were, French soldiers in blue and British in red, their uniforms torn and bloodied, fierce Iroquois wielding war axes, painted Mohawks with dripping scalps hanging from their belts. The phantoms were all around him, fighting one another, gliding in and out of the dank mist. J.P. held his breath and listened. Now he heard, ever so faintly, the sound of Indian war whoops, the snap of muskets, and the screams of the dying. Or were they just the usual sounds of the night forest? The boy shivered. He shook his head to clear away the frightening, ghostly images. Suddenly, his two lead horses reared and whinnied in fear. There was a scuffle of hooves as the second pair reacted to them nervously. J.P. tugged hard at the reins. His father woke with a start and dove forward to help. Behind them, the next driver pulled in his team with an oath, barely avoiding a pileup. Meanwhile, the spooked horses kept bucking and snorting, refusing to move ahead. "Hold steady, John," his father cried. "Hold steady." "It's the Haints, Pa," J.P. gasped. "Bloody Pond. The horses can see 'em." Questions were being shouted up and down the line. Some of the troopers raced over with a lighted torch, and Colonel Knox rode up anxiously. The troopers ran to the front of the Becker's wagon and bent down. In a moment, they stood up, holding a young colonial soldier between them. The man's hair was matted, his uniform muddy, and he wore a foolish grin. He also reeked of brandy. When dragged to the side of the trail and doused with water, he came slowly out of his drunken stupor. Questioning him, the colonel learned the man was from a nearby Fort Lyman. Making his way back to camp, he'd lost his way and decided to have a quiet nap in the middle of the trail. "Blasted fool!" Will Knox shouted. He grabbed the soldier's coat, gave him a tongue lashing, and started him back to the fort with a well-placed kick. Grinning, the colonel took off his hat and wiped his brow. "I guess we've had enough ruckus for one day," he said. "Pass the word. We'll make camp here." After supper, J.P. rolled himself gratefully in his blankets. Luckily, nobody but his father had heard his frightened, panicky outburst. No harm was done. He was glad that his ghost had turned out to merely be a drunken soldier. Still, John Becker would be very happy in the morning to turn his back on Bloody Pond. Chapter 17, South to Claverack. This one also has a song, and James Taylor's going to sing a bit of it for you in a minute. Will and his brother stood on the bank and stared at the river, which was choked with ice floes. William began to sing an old folk song.
The water is wide.
I cannot cross, and neither have I wings to fly. Build me a boat that will carry two, and we shall row, my love and I. So that's what Will was singing. The colonel grunted and waved his hand. We'll need more than a boat to get across this mess. We'll need a whole fleet. Sometimes I think the weather gods have turned royalist on us. South of Albany, the convoy was at a halt again. According to the plan, they were supposed to go back across the Hudson at this point. On the other side, they would pick up the old post road, a smooth route that would take them quickly to the town of Kinderhook. But their bad luck was continuing. A sudden thaw had set in, and the river ice had started to break up. It was now a mass of huge floes moving sluggishly downstream. There was no solid place where the teamsters could cross, and there were no barges nearby, not that they could have been much use on the ice-clogged river. Henry shook his head, staring at the ice floes that seemed to taunt him. For the first time since Lake George, he felt doubts about the plan, but he forced himself to sound confident. If we don't cross here, he said, we have to go miles out of the way, and we've lost too much time already. We'll stay put and pray for another freeze. Muttering to himself, he stomped over to the farmhouse serving as his headquarters. At the kitchen table, he sat down and wrote another letter to Lucy, whom he deeply missed. Then he sent a report to General Washington, which would go to Cambridge by courier. In it, he wrote, "The want of snow detained us for some days, and now a cruel thaw hinders us from crossing the Hudson River. The first severe night will make ice sufficiently strong. Till that happens, the cannon and mortars must remain where they are, which pains me exceedingly." After 48 hours of impatient waiting, which kept JP and everyone else on edge, the freeze finally came. The next morning, the river was solid, and the vehicles made their way slowly across the ice, going around the craggy floes that jutted up here and there. Once on the old post road, the men moved along at a steady pace. They reached Kinderhook without mishap, though some of the horses were trail weary and had to be replaced. After some resting here for a while, the train forded a shallow branch of the Moosic River and headed south to Claverack. For a while, the travelers had better luck. They reached town by nightfall, and again the whole community turned out to greet them. Colonel Knox was cheered. Pleased with their progress, it had been their best day yet. He was looking forward to an early morning start. Suddenly, there was a loud cracking noise. A sled hauling the 18-pounder had been weakened by the journey. It collapsed in a shower of splinters and broken wood. Henry and Will inspected the wreckage unhappily. Nobody had been hurt, but the vehicle looked like it had been smashed by a giant hammer. "We haven't any spare sleds," Henry sighed, "and that gun's too big to put on another load. We'll have to build a new sled, extra strong." The colonel's plan wasn't as simple as he thought. First, the right hardwood trees had to be located. Then they had to be cut down and sawed into planks and runners. Next, he had to find a local blacksmith to forge iron rims for the runners and bolt them in place. And finally, metal rings had to be attached to hold the harnesses. Henry growled over the delay. It took 2 full days to build and load the new vehicle. Then at last he gave the signal, and they started on their way. Leaving Claverack and the Hudson Valley behind, the caravan crossed into Massachusetts. Ahead lay the roughest part of the trip, the Berkshire Mountain Range. Here the tired men would face 100 miles of rough country. Wild country, steep hills and deep ravines, treacherous gorges, and streams filled with jagged rocks. For most of the way there were absolutely no roads or trails, not even crude footpaths. As they pushed on to Great Barrington, Will Knox studied the looming hills. He felt nervous and worried. The caravan was way behind schedule, and now they faced their biggest challenge. Some instinct told the young soldier that these high Rocky Mountains, and not the British, were going to be their worst enemy. I hope they make it. See you soon.